The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the crowded streets of London as James Mackenzie stepped out of his black taxi, adjusting his designer sunglasses with a practiced flick of his wrist. At 27, he carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone who believed the world revolved around him, a trait cultivated by his rapid rise as a tech executive in Silicon Valley's competitive landscape. Buckingham Palace loomed before him, its cream-colored walls and ornate architecture drawing countless tourists who clustered around the iron gates, the cameras clicking incessantly. James smirked, pulling out his latest model smartphone worth more than what most people earned in a month. Unlike these regular tourists, he had a reputation to maintain on his social media accounts, where his followers eagerly awaited his next post. "Excuse me, coming through," he announced loudly, pushing past a family with small children who were trying to take a photo. The mother shot him an annoyed look, but James didn't notice, or rather, chose not to notice. His expensive leather shoes clipped against the pavement as he made his way toward the front of the crowd. The day had started typically enough for James. He checked into his five-star hotel near Hyde Park the previous evening, demanding an upgrade to a suite because his original room's view wasn't Instagram-worthy enough. The hotel staff had reluctantly complied, more to avoid his theatrical complaints than out of any real obligation. Now, as he stood among the masses of tourists, James felt a bead of sweat roll down his neck. The temperature was unusually high for London, reaching nearly 30 degrees Celsius. He watched as other visitors fanned themselves with maps and tourist brochures, their faces red from the heat and excitement. The Queen's Guard stood perfectly still at his post, wearing the traditional red uniform and bearskin hat. Despite the sweltering temperature, the guard maintained his composure, staring straight ahead with unwavering discipline. James observed how other tourists respectfully maintained their distance while taking photos, but he had different plans. "This is so boring," he muttered, scrolling through his phone. "I need something more engaging for my followers." His last post from Paris, where he'd managed to sneak into a restricted area of the Louvre for a unique selfie, had gotten thousands of likes. He needed to top that. A group of Japanese tourists nearby were listening intently to their guide, who was explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. "These guards are not just ceremonial figures," the guide emphasized in accented English. "They are highly trained soldiers who take their duties very seriously." James scoffed at this information, earning several disapproving glances from those around him. He pulled out his water bottle, noting it was almost empty after his walk through St. James's Park. The public fountain nearby caught his attention, and a mischievous idea began forming in his mind. An elderly British gentleman, noticing James's restless movement toward the guard, spoke up. "Young man, I'd advise you to maintain a respectful distance. These guards are not here for entertainment." "Whatever," James replied dismissively, his American accent thick with arrogance. "I've seen these guys on YouTube. They're just there for show." He continued to edge closer, ignoring the growing murmurs of concern from the crowd. What James failed to notice were the supple movements of the Metropolitan Police officers stationed nearby. They had been watching his behavior since he arrived, recognizing the telltale signs of a troublemaker. The surveillance cameras mounted discreetly on the palace walls had also picked up his movements, and security personnel inside were already on alert. The guard remained motionless, but his peripheral vision tracked James's every move. Years of military training had taught him to be aware of potential threats while maintaining his ceremonial stance. The temperature under his heavy uniform was nearly unbearable, but his discipline never wavered. As James approached the fountain, an American couple nearby whispered to each other about his behavior. "Someone should stop him," the woman said worriedly to her husband. "He's going to get himself in trouble." The tension in the air was palpable as James filled his water bottle, his face sporting a smug grin. Other tourists began backing away, some already holding up their phones to record what they suspected would be an incident worth capturing. The peaceful summer morning at Buckingham Palace was about to take an unexpected turn, and James Mackenzie had no idea how his next actions would change the course of his entire vacation, and perhaps his life. The midday sun continued its relentless assault as James positioned himself strategically near the Queen's Guard, his water bottle now full and hidden behind his back. The crowd around him had grown larger, drawn not by the usual grandeur of Buckingham Palace, but by the palpable tension created by this brash American tourist. Sarah Chen, a student from Hong Kong who had been photographing the palace architecture, lowered her camera to watch the unfolding scene. She'd visited enough tourist spots worldwide to recognize the warning signs of somebody about to do something foolish. The expressions on nearby visitors' faces ranged from concern to morbid curiosity, like spectators at an accident waiting to happen. "Mate, you really don't want to do whatever you're thinking?" called out a young British man in a Liverpool football jersey. His girlfriend tugged at his arm, whispering for him to stay out of it. James turned to face them, his expensive sunglasses reflecting the sunlight as he smiled condescendingly. "Do what?" "I'm just trying to get a good photo," James replied, his voice dripping with fake innocence. He pulled out his phone again, making a show of trying to frame the perfect shot. The guard remained motionless, but there was a subtle tightening of his jaw, a minor detail noticed only by those closest to him. A family of 4 from Australia had been enjoying their tour when they spotted the brewing situation. The father, a former military man himself, recognized the telltale signs of an impending confrontation. He ushered his children back, explaining quietly to his wife that things might get unpleasant. James's social media addiction had landed him in trouble before, but never with such high stakes. His followers had doubled after his Paris stunt, and the rush of viral fame had become like a drug. Each new destination required something more outrageous than the last. His boss back in Silicon Valley had warned him about his online behavior affecting the company's image, but James had dismissed these concerns with his usual arrogance. 2 teenage girls nearby were live streaming the scene on their phones, providing commentary in whispered voices. "He's going to get arrested," one predicted, while her friend nodded in agreement. Their broadcast was already attracting viewers who sensed something dramatic was about to unfold. The guard stood at his post, seemingly oblivious to the drama building around him. His red uniform, perfectly pressed and maintained, showed dark patches of sweat from the unusual heat. Yet his discipline never wavered, the result of months of rigorous training and years of military service before joining the Queen's Guard. A tour guide, standing with her group several meters away, had stopped her usual historical narrative. Instead, she was quietly explaining to her clients why approaching the guards was strictly forbidden. Some of her group were taking photos, not of the palace now, but of James and his increasingly suspicious behavior. "I bet these guards aren't even real soldiers," James announced loudly to no one in particular, trying to provoke a reaction. His comment drew sharp intakes of breath from several British tourists who understood just how wrong he was. The guard's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle, the only sign that he'd heard the insult. The Metropolitan Police officers had moved closer now, maintaining a careful distance but ready to intervene. They'd seen countless tourists test the boundaries over the years, but something about this American's demeanor suggested he wouldn't be satisfied with just taking photos. James checked his phone again, ensuring his camera was ready to capture whatever chaos he was about to create. His social media followers had been commenting all morning, egging him on to do something legendary at the palace. The pressure to maintain his online persona had long ago overshadowed his better judgment. The temperature seemed to rise even further as the crowd held its collective breath. A young mother covered her children's eyes, sensing the impending disaster. The Australian family had retreated to a safe distance, the father already reaching for his phone to dial security. Standing barely 3 meters from the guard, James gripped his water bottle tighter, his palms sweaty with anticipation. The guard's shadow fell across the pavement like a line in the sand, a boundary between proper behavior and consequences that James was about to cross. The stage was set, the audience was ready, and James Mackenzie, self-proclaimed social media influencer, was about to learn a harsh lesson about respect, tradition, and the real meaning of consequences at one of Britain's most revered institutions. Time seemed to slow down as James Mackenzie made the decision that would forever change his London vacation. With a theatrical flourish, he pulled the water bottle from behind his back, his face lit up with the kind of smile reserved for those who think they're about to do something incredibly clever. "Hey, guard, you look a little hot there. Let me help you cool down," James called out loudly, his voice carrying across the now hushed crowd. Before anyone could stop him, he unscrewed the cap and flung the water in a wide arc, directly at the Queen's Guard. The water sparkled in the sunlight for a brief moment before splashing across the guard's red uniform and bearskin hat. For a split second, everything was still. Then chows erupted. The guard, trained for various scenarios but rarely facing such blatant disrespect, broke his stance. In one fluid motion, he turned to face James, his rifle shifting to a ready position. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of centuries of military discipline. "Step back. You are detained." Simultaneously, the two Metropolitan Police officers who had been watching nearby sprung into action. They moved with practiced efficiency, covering the distance to James in mere seconds. The first officer grabbed James's arm while the second kicked aside the water bottle, which clattered across the pavement. "What's the big deal? It's just water," James protested, his cocky smile fading as he realized the situation was spiraling out of his control. The crowd had transformed from passive observers to active participants, with several people shouting their disapproval. "You bloody idiot," someone yelled from the crowd. Others joined in with various insults and expressions of disgust. The Japanese tour group that had been nearby earlier was furiously documenting everything, their guide translating the unfolding drama in rapid-fire Japanese. Palace security personnel emerged from seemingly nowhere, their black suits and earpieces marking them as a different breed of protector than the ceremonial guard. They quickly established a perimeter, pushing back the growing crowd of onlookers who were all trying to capture the perfect angle of James's humiliation. The guard who had been splashed maintained his new position, water still dripping from his uniform, as another guard marched out to relieve him. The changing of positions was executed with military precision, despite the unusual circumstances. James's face had lost all color as the police officers secured his arms behind his back. His expensive phone dropped to the ground, its screen cracking, a fitting metaphor for his shattered arrogance. The live-streaming teenagers squealed with excitement, their broadcast now reaching thousands of viewers worldwide. "Sir, you are under arrest for assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces," one of the officers announced formally. "This is a serious offense under British law." The words seemed to finally penetrate James's consciousness, and his expression shifted from confusion to fear. The crowd had swelled to nearly double its original size, with people pushing forward to see the aftermath of James's foolish decision. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, pointing out how actions have consequences. The Australian father who had moved his family away earlier was nodding with grim satisfaction. "My phone. My followers need to see this." James protested weakly as he was led away, seemingly more concerned about his social media presence than his legal situation. One of the security personnel picked up his cracked phone, placing it in an evidence bag with practiced efficiency. Sarah Chen, the Hong Kong student who had witnessed everything from the beginning, shook her head as she reviewed the photos on her camera. She had captured the entire sequence, from James's smug preparation to his current state of distress. These weren't the kind of photos she had planned to take at Buckingham Palace, but they told a powerful story. The water on the ground was already evaporating in the hot sun, but the consequences of James's actions were just beginning to materialize. Palace staff appeared with incident report forms, and several witnesses were asked to provide statements. The entire area had transformed from a tourist attraction to a crime scene in less than 5 minutes. As James was escorted toward a waiting police vehicle, his designer sunglasses askew and his confident demeanor completely evaporated. He finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. The crowd's phones followed his walk of shame, ensuring that his next viral moment would be very different from what he had planned. The Queen's Guard had resumed their normal positions, the wet uniform the only evidence of the incident. But for James Mackenzie, this was just the beginning of a very long day. Inside the stark interview room at the nearby police station, James Mackenzie sat alone, his designer clothes now creased and his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the worry lines that had formed in the past hour. Through the one-way glass, Detective Inspector Claire Thompson watched the American tourist fidget in his chair. In her 15 years with the Metropolitan Police, she dealt with numerous incidents involving tourists, but something about this case particularly irritated her. She picked up the case file, which already contained printed screenshots from various social media platforms showing James's history of disruptive behavior at other tourist sites. "His passport, ma'am," announced Constable Roberts, entering the observation room with a blue American passport in an evidence bag. "And we've received the initial report from Palace Security. The guard's uniform will need professional cleaning and restoration. Estimated cost is over £2,000. Outside the police station, a small group of journalists had gathered, alerted by the viral videos already circulating online. The incident had exploded across social media platforms, with hashtags like hashtag Buckingham Palace Idiot and hashtag Arrogant Tourists trending in multiple countries. Back in the interview room, James stared at his reflection in the mirror, wondering if his company's PR team would be able to smooth this over. His phone, now sealed in evidence, contained dozens of missed calls and messages from his boss, family, and increasingly concerned friends. Detective Inspector. Look, it was just a joke, James replied, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. I didn't mean any harm, it was just water. He ran his fingers through his hair, a nervous gesture that betrayed his growing anxiety. Just water? Thompson replied, opening the folder. Let me explain exactly what you've done. You've assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard, interfered with a serving military officer during active duty, and damaged a historical uniform that dates back to the 19th century. The color drained from James's face as Thompson continued listing the potential charges. Each offense she mentioned seemed to make him sink lower in his chair. The reality of his situation was finally hitting home. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, a small team of specialists had arrived to assess the damage to the guard's uniform. The water had left visible marks on the wool tunic, and the bearskin hat would require special treatment to prevent any lasting damage. The guard himself, now off duty, was giving his statement to palace security. Lance Corporal William Hayes, a decorated soldier with 2 tours in Afghanistan, described the incident with military precision, his composure restored but his pride still wounded. Back at the station, Detective Thompson laid out several printed screenshots from James's social media accounts. Your history shows a pattern of disrespecting historical sites and cultural institutions for online attention. The palace is pressing charges, Mr. Mackenzie. This isn't Paris or Rome. We take these matters very seriously in London. James's hands began to tremble slightly as he looked at the evidence before him. His own posts, his carefully curated image of being an edgy, rule-breaking influencer, now seemed childish and embarrassing in the harsh light of consequences. Your passport has been confiscated, Thompson continued, her voice professional but stern. You'll need to remain in London while this matter is investigated. Do you understand the seriousness of your situation? Outside the interview room, Constable Roberts was coordinating with the American Embassy, following standard protocol for cases involving U.S. citizens. The embassy staff's response was cool and formal. They had little sympathy for tourists who deliberately violated local laws. The gravity of his situation finally seemed to break through James' remaining defenses. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since his arrival in London, his carefully constructed facade of superiority crumbled completely. I didn't think, he stammered, looking down at his hands. I just wanted the views and likes. I never thought. His voice trailed off as he realized how hollow his excuses sounded. Detective Thompson gathered her papers, standing up. You'll have plenty of time to think now, Mr. Mackenzie. We'll resume this interview after you've spoken with your legal representation. She moved toward the door, pausing briefly. Welcome to London, Mr. Mackenzie, though not quite the visit you planned, I imagine. The door closed behind her with a definitive click, leaving James alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that his social media stunt had just become a legal nightmare. 3 hours had passed since James Mackenzie's arrest, and the situation had only grown more serious. He now sat in a different interview room, this time accompanied by Marcus Blackwood, a stern-faced British solicitor arranged by his company's London office. The lawyer's presence did little to comfort James as he faced the mounting evidence against him. The palace is pursuing maximum penalties, Blackwood explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. We're looking at potential fines exceeding £10,000, and that's before we factor in the restoration costs for the uniform. The lawyer's words hung heavy in the air as James slumped further into his chair. On the desk between them lay a stack of printouts, screenshots from news websites worldwide covering the incident. The story had exploded far beyond social media now. Major news networks were running the footage, and James's face was plastered across international headlines. Tech executive assaults Queen's Guard. Silicon Valley arrogance meets British justice. Palace prankster faces serious charges. Your employer called, Blackwood continued, his tone measured but grave. There? Concerned about the company's reputation, he paused, allowing the implication to sink in. The board is meeting tomorrow morning to discuss your position. James's throat tightened. His £200,000 a year job, his stock options, his carefully cultivated career. Everything he built over the past 5 years now teetered on the edge of destruction. His social media accounts, once his pride and joy, had become a tsunami of negative comments and mockery. Detective Thompson returned, carrying a new set of documents. The palace's legal team has prepared their initial statement of damages, she announced, sliding a document across the table. They're also considering a civil suit for reputational damages. James's eyes widened as he scanned the figures. The cost of the uniform restoration was just the beginning. The palace was claiming his actions had disrupted their security protocols, necessitating a review and temporary reinforcement of their procedures, all at considerable expense. Furthermore, Thompson continued, several travel companies have filed complaints. Your actions caused significant disruption to their tour schedules, resulting in financial losses. She placed another document on the growing pile. They're considering joint legal action. Outside the police station, the media presence had grown. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical trees. Reporters clutched microphones, waiting for any official statement or glimpse of the palace prankster. James's phone, temporarily returned to check important messages, buzzed continuously. His Instagram followers had plummeted by thousands. Comments ranged from disappointment to outright hostility. Brands he collaborated with were publicly announcing the termination of their partnerships. Your visa status is also under review, Blackwood added, consulting his notes. The Home Office takes a dim view of tourists who disrupt national institutions. You may face restrictions on future travel to the United Kingdom. The reality of his situation crashed over James in waves. Each new consequence seemed worse than the last. His hands shook as he reached for the glass of water on the table, nearly knocking it over. The guard you assaulted, Lance Corporal Hayes, has agreed to provide a victim impact statement, Detective Thompson continued. He's a decorated veteran with an exemplary service record. The military community is particularly upset about this incident. James' lawyer shuffled through more papers, his expression growing increasingly concerned. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the interview room's small window. In just a few hours, James had transformed from a confident, successful tech executive into a cautionary tale about respect, culture, and consequences. One more thing, Detective Thompson added, producing a final document. We've received complaints from several historical societies and veterans organizations. They're calling for this case to set a precedent for dealing with disruptive tourists at cultural sites. James finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Can't we just make this go away? I can pay whatever they want. The desperation in his tone was palpable. Blackwood shook his head slowly. Mr. Mackenzie, this isn't about money anymore. You've managed to offend not just the palace, but the military, the British public, and several influential institutions. This incident has become much bigger than a simple prank. As the gravity of his situation continued to sink in, James realized that his moment of social media-inspired madness had set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. The consequences were still unfolding, and the worst might be yet to come. As evening descended over London, James Mackenzie found himself in a small holding cell at the police station, the gravity of his situation crushing down on him like a physical weight. The cold metal bench beneath him was a far cry from his luxury hotel suite, where his luggage still sat unpacked from the morning. Through the small window of his cell, he could hear the distant sounds of reporters still camped outside the station. His name was being mentioned in multiple languages, a kind of fame he'd always craved, but not like this. Never like this. His lawyer had left an hour ago to begin negotiations with the palace's legal team, leaving James alone with his thoughts. The last thing Blackwood had told him was that his company's board had called an emergency meeting. The words gross misconduct and termination hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Tears welled up in his eyes as he remembered his mother's voicemail. The disappointment and worry in her voice had been unbearable. Jimmy, what were you thinking? Your father? He's so upset he can't even come to the phone. The nickname Jimmy brought back memories of a simpler time, before social media followers and viral fame had become his obsession. In the adjacent office, Detective Thompson was reviewing security footage from the palace. The cameras had captured everything in pristine detail. James's smug expression, the deliberate way he filled the water bottle, the premeditated nature of his actions. Each frame was another nail in the coffin of his defense. "Please," James called out to the guard passing his cell. "I need to speak to someone. Anyone. I'll do anything to make this right." His voice cracked with desperation. The guard paused, observing the once arrogant tourist now reduced to pleading. Moments later, Detective Thompson entered the cell area. She stood outside, observing James through the bars. "Mr. Mackenzie, do you understand now? Do you truly understand what you've done?" James nodded frantically, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. His designer shirt, wrinkled and stained with sweat, no longer held any importance. "I was stupid, so stupid. I've spent years building this online persona, trying to be controversial, trying to stand out. And for what? Likes? Comments?" His phone, when briefly returned earlier, had shown the true extent of the damage. His company's stock had dropped 2 points after news of the incident broke. His LinkedIn profile was flooded with negative comments. Former colleagues were publicly distancing themselves. Years of carefully constructed networking, destroyed in minutes. "Lance Corporal Hayes," Thompson said quietly, "the guard you assaulted, do you know his background?" She pulled out a file. 2 tours in Afghanistan, military cross for bravery under fire, and today he had to stand there while you treated him like a prop for your social media entertainment. The words hit James like physical blows. He slid down to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cold cell bars. "I'll apologize. Publicly. I'll pay for everything. I'll do community service. Anything. Please, I can't lose everything over one stupid mistake." Outside the station, news crews were preparing their evening broadcasts. Live from London, where American tech executive James Mackenzie faces serious charges. Their voices carried faintly through the building, each word another reminder of his spectacular fall from grace. His lawyer's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "This isn't just about you anymore, Mr. Mackenzie. You become a symbol of everything the British public resents about disrespectful tourists. They want to make an example of you." James's shoulders shook as he finally broke down completely. The facade of the confident, carefree influencer shattered, revealing the scared, foolish man beneath. His carefully curated online life seemed meaningless now, faced with real-world consequences. "I just want to go home," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. But home felt very far away, and the path back would be longer and harder than he ever imagined. Detective Thompson watched him for a moment longer before speaking. "Sometimes, Mr. Mackenzie, the hardest lessons are the ones we need most." She paused. "Your lawyer will return in the morning. I suggest you use this time to reflect on how you want to proceed." As she walked away, James remained on his knees, his forehead still pressed against the cold metal bars. In the gathering darkness of his cell, he finally understood that some things couldn't be fixed with money, charm, or social media influence. Some mistakes leave marks that no amount of filtered photos or clever captions can erase. His real punishment wasn't the fines or the legal troubles. It was the crushing realization of who he'd become, and the long road ahead to make it right. 2 days after the infamous water-splashing incident, James Mackenzie stood before the magistrate's court in Westminster, his transformation complete. Gone was the designer clothing and cocky demeanor, replaced by a modest suit and genuinely remorseful expression. His lawyer, Marcus Blackwood, stood beside him as the charges were read. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, their pens poised to record every detail of the final act in this viral drama. In the public gallery, Lance Corporal Hayes sat in his civilian clothes, his military bearing unmistakable even in casual attire. "Your Honor," Blackwood addressed the court, "my client wishes to make a statement before sentencing." The magistrate nodded, and James stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he held his prepared speech. "I stand before you today deeply ashamed of my actions," James began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "What I did was not just disrespectful to Lance Corporal Hayes and the institution he represents. It was an insult to British tradition and values. My obsession with social media fame led me to forget basic human decency." In the back of the courtroom, Detective Thompson watched with professional detachment. She'd seen many remorseful defendants before, but something about Mackenzie's transformation seemed genuine. The past 48 hours had broken him down and rebuilt him into someone almost unrecognizable from the arrogant tourist who'd arrived at Buckingham Palace. The magistrate's sentence came swiftly: a £15,000 fine, payment for all damages and associated costs, and a formal written apology to be published in major newspapers. Additionally, James would be required to complete 200 hours of community service at British historical sites before leaving the country. Outside the courthouse, James faced the media for the first time since his arrest. Cameras flashed as he read a prepared statement, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded steps. "My actions were inexcusable," he declared, looking directly into the cameras. "To Lance Corporal Hayes, the palace staff, and the British people, I offer my deepest apologies. I've learned that respect isn't something you can buy with money or followers. It's earned through actions and character." His company had indeed terminated his employment, but surprisingly, the public nature of his redemption arc had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A prominent ethics consulting firm had already reached out, interested in having him speak to corporations about social media responsibility and cultural sensitivity. Lance Corporal Hayes approached James after the media dispersal. Their handshake, captured by remaining photographers, would become the final viral image of the incident, not of conflict, but of reconciliation. "The uniform's been restored," Hayes said simply. "Make sure you learn from this, yeah?" James nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the soldier's words. In the weeks that followed, James fulfilled his community service requirements with genuine enthusiasm, including specific warnings about respecting cultural institutions in their materials, often citing the Buckingham Palace incident as a cautionary tale. James's final act before leaving London was to deliver a talk to tourism students at a local university. "I came to the city thinking I was above its traditions and rules," he told them. "I left understanding that true influence comes not from viral moments, but from showing respect and understanding for the cultures we encounter." Detective Thompson attended the lecture, standing at the back of the hall. She watched as the students listened intently to James's story, noting how his experience had become a powerful lesson in consequences and redemption. As James finally boarded his flight back to San Francisco, his passport now stamped with a notation that would remind him of his actions for years to come, he carried with him something more valuable than social media fame: a genuine understanding of respect, humility, and the real cost of viral infamy. His phone buzzed one last time before takeoff, a message from his mother. "Proud of how you handled this, Jimmy. Come home soon." For the first time in years, the notification didn't trigger an urge to check his likes or follower count. The story of the arrogant tourist and the Queen's Guard would live on in social media archives and news reports, but its lasting impact wasn't in the viral moment of disrespect. It was in the transformation that followed, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our biggest mistakes. As his plane lifted off from British soil, James Mackenzie was no longer the same person who had arrived 2 weeks earlier. He had lost a job, but gained perspective; lost followers, but gained wisdom; lost his arrogance, but found something far more valuable: humility.